Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about virtualization. In this video, we'll talk about exactly what virtualization is. We'll look at some of the benefits you can get out of using virtualization. We'll take a look at some of the products that are currently available out there. Talk about some specific examples where you may want to use virtualization, and then look at some of the potential issues that come with it as well. So, what is virtualization? Well, virtualization is really a fancy word. It's a word I've probably already said too many times, but anyway, it's a word that represents the concept of having one physical computer act as though it is multiple computers. That's pretty cool, huh? In other words, I can have one physical box in my office, and on that one box, I can have many virtual machines. And each of those virtual machines will act independently of all the other virtual machines. Okay, so it's the concept of having one physical box, but on that box, in this instance, it's like having 4 actual computers. This is a great way of better utilizing the resources that are available on the computers that we currently own. Now, virtualization also allows for not just multiple instances of the same operating system, but also different operating systems to run on that same computer. So here is, for instance, I have Windows XP and Windows Vista virtual computers running on this one physical box. And so that's pretty cool that virtualization allows you to have a variety of operating environments. Matter of fact, you don't even have to stay within the same vendor. You can have Microsoft and non-Microsoft operating systems running on separate virtual machines. And again, the reason why is because each virtual machine is essentially like having a separate computer. It is completely independent of any other virtual machine. Now, the other really cool thing is that there are so many benefits to using virtualization, and we'll talk about these in just a moment, that these benefits can serve pretty much anybody, whether it be your average home user, to your average business user, to even high-end server solutions. Virtualization is really what looks to be the way of the future. I mean, that's the way everything is heading. Now let's take a look at some of these benefits. Now, the first one I have here is kind of the obvious one, which is server costs. Well, obviously, if you need to run 4 different servers, but you can have those 4 different servers now running on one physical computer, well, there's an obvious cost savings there. You only had to buy 1 computer instead of 4. Now, the reality is that this word right here, costs, that's the key word of pretty much across the board, no matter what benefit we're talking about. There was a term that was heavily used. Started back in the early 2000s, and it was called TCO, total cost of ownership. And that was a big deal. If you could get the total cost of ownership down on each of your computers, well, you were in good shape. Well, this would assist in the overall total cost of ownership of each of your computers, but also another term that's very heavily used is something called return on investment. Now again, the investment you make into a particular computer, you're going to get a much greater return on that investment by using virtualization. And you'll see that as we go through the rest of this video and we talk about the rest of the benefits of its use. Matter of fact, the very next one saves energy. Instead of having to have the energy needed to run multiple physical computers, you only have to have the energy to run the one physical computer. And obviously with the energy savings comes a cost savings. Okay, so everything always comes back to cost. Now what are some of the other benefits that we have here? Well, here we have separation of services. Many times you'll find yourself in a situation where you need to have multiple different services, or we could even say separation of roles when it comes to Windows Server 2008. You may want to have different server roles. You need them for your organization, but you don't really want to have them on the same physical box. Could be for security reasons, could be for management reasons. Whatever the reason is, I've seen it many, many times where we'll go ahead and separate the different services or roles into separate physical boxes. But then that also means more cost for the additional boxes, and then also just having to have more physical boxes laying around. You may have to have a much more sophisticated rack in your server room to be able to go ahead and host all those different physical servers. Whereas now you could have just the one computer and have multiple virtual machines or virtual servers on that one computer, and then each of those virtual machines can go ahead and host each of the separate services. Another benefit really relates to what we were just talking about, is where it's also easier to manage. I could just picture whether it's a small home office type environment where you have all these different computers in one tiny little office, or whether it be a corporate environment where you have a server room and you have a large rack and you have all these buttons and switches to make sure that you're on the correct computer, and you want to make sure that you don't mismanage the wrong computer. Well, now everything's in one place. And all you have to do to toggle between the different virtual computers is pretty much click back and forth the same way as you would toggle back and forth between applications on a computer. So it's much easier to manage. Compatibility issues. This is a big one. One of the really nice features of using virtualization is you can much more easily deal with compatibility issues. We've always had to deal with compatibility issues, especially when trying to do upgrades. So you may be in an environment where you're ready to go ahead and upgrade from, maybe you're currently using Server 2003 and you want to upgrade to Server 2008. But the problem is you have an application that still only works on Windows Server 2003. There is no available upgrade for that application to work on Server 2008. Well, in the past, what we used to do is we either did an upgrade, we waited and hoped that we would get availability of either that application's functionality or another application that would take its place, or we would go ahead and move forward with the upgrade but then keep some old computer laying around just for that one application. Well, now you can go forward with these upgrades and just go ahead and keep a virtual computer running the old operating system to go ahead and work with the old program. And another big one we have here is support for different platforms. And again, mentioned on the last screen where we talked about how you can have different platforms on a single physical computer. And then also, even with the compatibility issues, we were just talking about having Server 2003 and Server 2008 on the same computer. Whatever the reason might be for having a need for different platforms in your environment, and those different platforms, by the way, can either be different operating environments or could even be a completely separate platform, as in you might have a 32-bit and a 64-bit platform, both needed for different purposes. Well, your virtual computers don't even have to be on the same platform on that level either. A single physical computer using virtualization can actually host both a 32-bit and a 64-bit operating system. So there's a wide variety of selection available to you when using virtualization. Now, there's a number of different products that are currently out there, and I'm guessing that there's going to be more coming out in the future. Matter of fact, there will probably already be updates by the time that you are watching this video from the time that I'm creating it. Now, the first one I have listed here is Microsoft's Hyper-V. Hyper-V is a role that's built right into the 64-bit versions of Windows Server 2008. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is even though you have to have the 64-bit version of Windows Server 2008, that's just to have Hyper-V installed, have this role installed, have virtualization available to you. Your virtual machines could still be a 32-bit operating system. Okay, so we can do both. Now, the other thing that I will mention about Hyper-V, this is Microsoft's latest and greatest. And if you are planning on taking the 70-646 exam, or really any Microsoft exam for that matter, keep in mind that Hyper-V is most likely going to be the most heavily talked about in those environments. And that's because this is Microsoft's latest product. But speaking of Microsoft, there's also Microsoft Virtual Server and Virtual PC. Now, Virtual Server essentially is what was being replaced with Hyper-V. So we're probably not going to see much of Microsoft's Virtual Server going forward, but Microsoft Virtual PC was originally designed to work with the client operating systems, to work in a client environment, to go ahead and work with Windows Vista or Windows XP. Now, outside of Microsoft world, there's also a company out there called VMware, and they too have their server and workstation products. And they actually have a whole suite of products that go even beyond just your basic server and workstation. So just keep in mind, two of the main companies who are really heavily focusing on virtualization right now are Microsoft and VMware, but I expect that there will be others in the near future. Let's talk about some very specific examples where virtualization would make sense. First one, if you have a temporary need for an additional server, and because it's temporary, you just can't justify the cost of purchasing another computer. Maybe you have a project going on, and along with that project, you have a need for maybe not even just one additional server, maybe multiple additional servers. If you have physical resources available on any of your existing computers, this is a great opportunity to go ahead and just create virtual computers, and then you don't have to go out and spend the money on new computers. And then when you're done with your project, go ahead and delete those computers if they're no longer of use. Another example might be, and this is actually something we just talked about on the last screen, and that is you have an application which will only run on an older operating system. And it doesn't have to be Server 2003, like I mentioned before. I mean, you might have some old application that will only run on Windows 95 or Windows 98, or who knows what it might be. Well, if you have that application and you really want to use it, and you don't want to have to go either buy another computer or even just have to have one laying around. I mean, that could be such a nuisance, such an inconvenience, having that extra computer laying around. Well, this is another great opportunity to go ahead and use a virtual computer to satisfy the needs of that one application. Now, this one is one of my favorites. It's actually where I came in contact with virtualization in the first place, and that is if you need a test environment. If you need to test a new product but don't have, I have here the budget to purchase a test computer, but it really could be budget, could be room. It's such an overall inconvenience. If you're in a small home office or some small office, there may not be a lot of room. Along with the new computer, you may need to get a new monitor and keyboard and mouse, or otherwise you have to come up with some kind of a switching system, a KVM switch box. It's not always a whole lot of fun. You don't always have that luxury to go ahead and have a quote-unquote test environment. Well, this is a great example of where you can just go ahead and create a virtual machine, do all your testing in the virtual machine. Remember that that machine is completely independent of anything else, so it's also safe and secure. So if that new product causes problems, don't worry about it. It's secured within the virtual environment. Won't get out to your real environment. Matter of fact, along those lines, I'll tell you what, another great place where I've used it is anywhere that, not just to test new things, but anywhere that I don't feel that I'm in a secure situation at all. Maybe it's just an aspect of downloading a new product. And maybe you're not real certain, you're not real confident about where you're downloading it from. Maybe virus infested. You don't know everything that the product's going to do that might interfere with your environment. There's so much that goes on. Well, again, this is a great way to secure yourself from the rest of your network. So these are just 3 very basic examples of where you definitely could use virtualization to your benefit. And we could go on talking about these examples all day long because there are so many different opportunities available when using virtualization. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the issues that you need to be aware of when using virtualization, because virtualization is not necessarily for every circumstance. So let's see here. First thing I have is make sure you do not overuse the physical resources you have available. That's one of the things to really keep in mind. This is something I really haven't had to emphasize for, I don't know, probably close to a decade now. 10 years ago, I can remember talking to people about making sure that you have adequate resources on the computer to satisfy the needs. And an example might be, going back to the days of like Windows 95. Back when we used to talk about RAM in megabytes, not gigabytes. And in some cases, we were talking about that RAM or that memory in single digit or double digit megabytes. Okay, so single digit goes a little further back, but double digit, meaning we were talking about 16 megabytes, 32 megabytes, 64 megabytes of RAM. That was a big deal to have 64 megabytes of RAM on a Windows 95 computer. But I can remember talking to people about how the Windows 95 operating system will use X amount of memory. You want to run these 3 applications, and they each require X amount of memory. Add all that up, and now you know how much memory you need on the computer. But here's the deal. You didn't want to go ahead and purchase exactly that much memory. We always would say, make sure you have an extra 25% or maybe double what you think you're going to need. Well, that's the same issue that we now have again with virtualization. So we haven't had to talk about this in a while because today's computers have resources that go way beyond the needs of most operating environments and most applications. And that's actually where virtualization came into play, is because we're wasting all these resources, well, let's use them up now. You just want to be careful not to overuse them. You don't want to have 100% of your resources tied up at any given time on a single computer. Otherwise, performance is going to be very inefficient. So keep that in mind. Another potential issue is if you have, it says here a server, but instead of the word server, I could have said maybe a service or a role. In other words, if you have a need, if you have a particular server that's going to require a large quantity of a certain resource, and by certain resource, I'll put the emphasis on either the processor or your memory resources. Consider dedicating a single computer for that server, for those services. Okay, in other words, virtualization may not work very well if you have one of your virtual machines hogging all the resources. If you have one virtual machine that needs almost all the processing power, or what seems like an endless supply of processing power or memory, well, then the other virtual machines are not going to run very well. So that's a very good example of where not to use virtualization. Another thing to keep in mind is make sure you always have plenty of free space on your hard drives. See, a virtual machine is really nothing more than a very complex file on your hard drive. That's really all it is. And that's why it's so easy to add or remove one. If something bad happens to a virtual machine, you can eliminate it by just deleting that file that represents that virtual machine. Well, because it's a file on your actual physical hard drive, you need to keep in mind that each of those virtual machines that you have, as they grow, as they fill up their virtual hard drives, well, they're going to be tying up your physical hard drive. And the one last thing I need to point out to you here is going back to Microsoft's latest and greatest Hyper-V product. Well, although it is the latest and greatest, and it has some really nice, convenient features, it also comes with some additional hardware requirements which may not be met by many of your older computers. Now, for more information, I have a URL listed here where you can go see what these requirements are. And as a matter of fact, let me go ahead and click on that now. Okay, if I click on the link here, go ahead and take us on out to this website. Let me go ahead and expand this here. You'll see here that this is an article on the Hyper-V installation prerequisites. Let me go ahead and move this over so we can see as much as we can here. And it's these 3 main bullet points that you need to keep in mind. You need to have an x64 or 64-bit based processor, Okay, I mean, Hyper-V is only available in the 64-bit version of Windows Server 2008. Well, you also need to have a 64-bit based processor. You need to have hardware-assisted virtualization, which is typically available with processors that are designed for virtualization, and they have listed here specifically Intel VT or AMD V. Okay, so those are a couple of virtualization processors. And then you also need to have hardware data execution protection available and enabled for those processors. So this is the first time that we're seeing these more advanced hardware requirements so that we can get the sophistication and reliability that we really need from our virtualization servers. Let me go ahead and close out of here. That's one thing to definitely keep in mind is, virtualization has been around now for quite a few years. But it's always had its hangups. It's always been slow, or other pitfalls that you'd run into with communication and the availability of resources. Well, Hyper-V addresses a lot of those former issues, but in order to do so, it needs a little help from the hardware. It needs to have hardware that's ready to support it. So please keep that in mind if you're going to use Hyper-V as your virtualization option. Okay, well, at this point you should now know what virtualization is, and remember, it's really nothing more than the concept of having one physical computer with many virtual machines installed on it. Many of the benefits of using virtualization, of which I could narrow down into 3 primary benefits, one being cost savings, that's probably the most important one. 2 being anywhere you need to have multiple platforms, whether it be different operating systems or different levels like 32-bit and 64-bit. And the 3rd being anywhere you need to be in a safe, secure environment from the rest of your network. You should know that both Microsoft and VMware currently make virtualization products, and I expect there will be more in the near future. And when you should and also should not use virtualization. Now, the one last thing I want to point out is we really didn't take a look at any of the specific virtualization products. And if you want to see a step-by-step demonstration on how to install and configure Hyper-V, then I encourage you to go ahead and watch Coach's Hyper-V installation video, which we've included as a bonus with this course.